That's rough. Rough going, as a matter of fact. Today's video is a response, not an argument, just some additional thoughts to add to a conversation that Mike Hutchinson and Glenn Ford had over on Rule of Carnage, another YouTube channel. Mike Hutchinson, you're probably thinking, my goodness, that name sounds familiar. Well, yeah, it should be. It's all over here on the Gaslands page. And not only that, but Glenn Ford, you're going to have to take my word for it, because I'm not going to mess with the white balance and stuff. It says here, thanks to Glenn Ford for helping with the development. All right, so Mike and Glenn, professional game designer. I'm just a YouTube, low-rent celebrity. What do I know? Well, I got some thoughts. And I love their show, Rule of Carnage. If you're not subscribed to it already, you're just not going to make it. I don't know what to tell you. They're great. They do deep dives into all kinds of aspects of miniature wargaming. And on Friday, they did a deep dive into rough going and why this is the worst thing to happen to miniature war games since role-playing games. I'm kidding, of course. Role-playing games, if you're doing them right, are miniature war games. But that's a subject for another day. The subject for today is why Glenn Ford hates rough going. And not necessarily rough going, but the conventional wisdom about how these operate within the game space. And just to set our terms and our expectations, the way these are generally used, well, if there are trees on them, then they block line of sight. So I have a couple of miniatures handy. I've got Mr. Space Dwarf, who cannot shoot at Mr. War Dog Incorporated. Mr. Mid-Tech, he's a Mid-Tech power armor boy from Coruscant. And then this old fellow over here is one of the Space Vikings that you can get from alternative armies. Hey, look, it blocks line of sight. And one of the things they mention, and I think it was a little bit tongue-in-cheek, is Look, I've got two little trees, a couple of rocks. I mean, clearly they can see each other. Unless your figures are like little tiny matchstick men, it doesn't really block line of sight, does it? All right, well, hold on now. Remember that this hobby of ours is based, it's impressionistic painting, not realist. We need to paint the impression of a woods, and so we put a couple of trees down. In the same manner that this guy here with the gun doesn't slide along in a mono pose, he represents a real dynamic figure who may be crouching, maybe lying down, maybe running, maybe, all kinds of stuff. It's all baked into this little thing. We need to incorporate functionality. I might need to put my guy in here, and if the trees are to ground scale and jammed up so they're completely blocking line of sight, there's no way to get my figure in there. So that's the first thing. Second thing to be aware of is, and I think this is really worth thinking about at a deep level, for those of you that are new to miniature wargamings, thinking about things this deep may be new for you, but we need to kind of step back once in a while and remember what it is we're doing. Let me make the case, first of all, that in the instance of our tabletop, it's this nice, flat, monotone feature. And I have a gray plane here, right? Kind of an ashy waste. It's the moon before it's been completely terraformed. And there may be gullies, and there may be rocks, and there may be all kinds of features, but the features that don't affect the game don't need to be represented as a game piece. In other words, there may be a gully running between these two figures. But if it's not a gully that impedes movement in any way, then we don't put it down there. There may be a forest right here, but if that forest is not so dense that it doesn't slow movement, it doesn't block line of sight, then we don't need to put it on the table any more than we would need to put down a figure that is invisible, can't be targeted, can't affect other figures. It's a non-entity. So the convention that we have is that a base like this that represents rough ground. And again, if we take a look at the model that I have here, there is a nice little bowling. This is almost a putting green smooth. Why is everything within the brown classed as difficult going? Because from our game space, we're not going to necessarily model every single piece of bracken and bramble. That would get in the way, so we paint this thing that helps us kind of draw a line in which inside there's an effect and outside there's no effect. It's impressionistic. So that's the first thing to be aware of, that there may be all kinds of things going on the table that we just don't model because we don't need to. The area inside the brown, my terrain piece here, is rough going, and in this case, it doesn't block line of sight. But it does, and I'm not really going to talk so much about line of sight, because whether the trees are tall or whether they're not doesn't really matter. We have established that if this is, and there are times, there are games, and there are genres where I put a number of trees on here and say, hey, You can't move through here. This completely blocks line of sight and movement. Tend to think of those as heavy woods. They completely block everything. There's no effect. Unless you can fly, you ain't getting over, you ain't getting through. That allows us a little bit of flexibility. This one terrain piece can serve as heavy woods, or it can serve as light woods. And with light woods, this is where you run into the case where, oh, it blocks line of sight, but maybe it only has an impact on movement. And that's what we're going to talk about. Same thing. I'm going to move the trees out of the way so we can see. Same thing as if this is rough ground, in which case, hey, if I've got an archer who's trying to use this as a means of blocking somebody out, well, maybe they have to make 2 moves to get to me, so I get an extra shot. Maybe they have to make 2 moves through it, so I get an extra shot. But the point is that, in general, the conventional wisdom is when you have rough going, it slows your movement by half. Now, my guy has a movement of, let's call it 6 inches. He moves 2 inches to here. Normally, if this did not block movement, he would be able to move 4 inches. But because it does slow movement, now he can move 2. And that is an operation, a mathematical process that you have to engage in order to interact with this terrain tile. Mike Hutchinson made the case that by including a portion of the ground where you move at half speed, you get to the point and then you have less fun because you're doing less stuff. Now, here's where I have to say, just because you're not moving doesn't mean that you're not enjoying what's going on. The whole thing with miniature war games is that it's all about meaningful choices. And the speed doesn't necessarily impact that. There have been a host of cases where you have a figure who stands here. And imagine you're 300. We'll put another forest over here. And this powerful figure stands right here so that the other guy can't get through there. He completely blocks this route of attack. And even though he's not moving and he forces the opponent to walk around this way, he's still exerting influence on the table space. It's not merely the act of moving that is the enjoyment. It is the analysis, and it is the weighing of the options of risks and rewards. That's where the fun comes in. And there have been a number of games where deployment went so well, I don't need to move. I'm going to win the game without moving. I'm forcing the guy to react to my deployment. In the case of rough ground, we have a situation where if we had no rough going, there is a straight line distance between our 2 figures. By adding this variable to the equation, now we have an interesting choice. Do we move through or do we move around? If it takes 2 turns to move around versus through, then it's not really a choice. I mean, it's a choice without a distinction. It doesn't really matter, right? But what if I have 3 guys who all want to attack this unit? And I'm just using my sci-fi figures. It could be blocks of troops, rank and flank. Well, now we have an interesting situation where we may want to move this guy up once. And these guys are exerting pressure. Perhaps we're trying to get in touch with this guy, and he needs to figure out, well, normally it would be a simple question of, well, I'm going to move all 3 guys up. But I might need, in order to get all 3 to converge on him, now I need to make that choice. Do I move up my middle figure on this turn? And then move, well, do I move these guys less far? But the question is, I got to time it right. I have to make sure that my guys are arriving at the same time so I can bring maximum power to bear. That involves a bit of planning and a bit of coordination. And if we do this right, we may force him, and this is one of the things Glenn said, is, hey, by slowing our boy down, all we've done is given our opponent time to make the choice himself. Well, that's not necessarily a bad thing. This is the nature of the game. He can run off and fulfill his obligations. Well, perhaps, but, and then he's dealt with this guy, and he can come back, and now he's going to deal with this guy. See, isn't that great? All you did was cost yourself an opportunity to converge. Well, maybe if your plan is terrible, that's true. But maybe by taking your time, and remember, you're in ground that blocks the line of sight, you force the opponent into making one of those difficult choices. More to the point, there was the question of, hey, if I'm moving at half speed through here, then I am only half able to do what I want to do. All right, let's engage in a little bit of an intellectual exercise here. Let us pretend that we have a table. Well, okay. First, we should talk about the fact that by including a distinction between ground outside and inside of our terrain feature, we open up the possibility for a figure, and in this case, our space dwarf is going to be on the attack. Let us say that our figure has the ability that this terrain does not affect him. In other words, he moves at his full speed. In the case of a game like Dragon Rampant, they call that ability fleet-footed. Wood Elves are a classic case of a figure that is not slowed by terrain. And in this case, you have a special ability where our bulky armor guy, our knights on horseback, they struggled to get through this. And so they are forced to decide whether they want to move around or not. But our fella here, he moves at full speed. In other words, wow, but what's the downside? Maybe he costs more points. Maybe he's not as strong as the figure that is slowed by this terrain. Maybe he fights really bad outside of the terrain piece and much better inside the terrain piece. And we have to decide, do I use him to run off and solve objectives to claim victory points elsewhere? Or do we move him in to claim this point of ground and prevent our knights from moving through, for example? We have choices that wouldn't exist if we didn't have this distinction between inside the terrain and outside the terrain, and we have a new variable that we have to consider in our gamesmanship. Returning now to the fact that, well, if I'm moving at half speed inside this, then I'm having half as much fun. Let's flip that around, and let us say that everyone on the table moves at a given speed, but this guy moves at double speed through here. So typically, your foot figures will move, let's call it 4 inches. This guy will move at 8 inches now instead of 4 inches everywhere. And this guy will move at 8 inches unless he's moving through here, in which case he can move 2 inches per inch. So he goes twice as fast. Mathematically, there's no difference. This guy is twice as fast as this guy when moving through the terrain. Whether that means he is slowed by half, whether our big guy is slowed by half or our little guy doubles his speed doesn't make a difference. Functionally, it's the same thing. This guy has an ability to move more rapidly than the opposition when certain conditions are met. And in this case, it's a geometric condition. That's an interesting thing to have to consider when you're compiling your army lists and putting down your terrain. Well, how much terrain do we want? And when you have things like mini games where you take turns putting terrain down, if you have a force that is very good at moving through rough ground, you're going to want to put as much down as possible. Your opponent, if he does not, will not. And so you have to kind of balance the terrain, and it may be a case where as you sit down, you have to hash that out with your opponent. Look, we need to have a good mix of terrain so that I have areas where I excel and you have areas where you excel. That's interesting stuff, man. I don't know why you would give that up. But there's something else that they didn't really talk about a whole lot, and we've touched on it a little bit in this video, and that's the way that Lion Rampant handles not just movement through rough going, but combat as well. Because there's another ability in Lion Rampant called Ranger. And if you are a Ranger, you're not affected by rough ground. This is a fantasy game, but the science fiction rules apply as well for Xenos Rampant. In this case, normally our boys, if they're going to get stabby, we're gonna do a little bit of melee. A big, strong, elite fighter rolls a d6. In fact, it's a unit of them. You're gonna roll 12 d6, and you're hitting on 3s. Our guys who aren't as good are only hitting on 6s. So if you're rolling 12 dice, hitting on 3s means you're hitting 8 times. If you're hitting on 6s, you're only hitting twice. But the curious thing about Lion Rampant is that it allows for scouts who are very good at taking advantage of rough going because their profile does not change when they are in rough going. Doesn't change at all. In other words, if this guy who normally hits on 6s is in the rough going, normally hits on 6s, he hits on 5. Well, sorry, back up. When you're in rough going, you always attack and you always defend, meaning counterattack, on fives. The number of hits translates to wounds. The number of hits you get, you have to compare it to the armor. So a heavily armored guy with an armor of 4, you have to get 4 hits. And a lightly armored guy, you might normally only need 1 hit. However, if we move, now neither of these guys have any special abilities. If you move into rough going, everybody fights with the same profile. You hit on 5s, you defend on 5s, and you have an armor of 2. Meaning our little peasant here, who normally hits on 6s and only has an armor of 1, when he gets into the woods, he is able to take advantage of all those trees and rocks and the fact that the armor slows our boy down as he stumbles over rocks and it's harder to see and you got to hide behind trees. Our guy who normally hits on 3s now only hits on 5s. So he's in a situation where he's only getting 4 hits per turn. Yeah, okay, well, he's going to do 2 wounds per round, but this guy also is going to do 2 wounds per round, and you've leveled the playing field, but only inside our geographic feature. To which you might say, well, then our elite fighter would be a fool to go in the feature. Why would he not simply treat it as do not enter? Great question. There's 2 answers to that. One is, what if there's an objective in there? Now, you've got to go in to secure the objective. You might not have much of a choice. You might have to spend your big, expensive, heavily armored unit fighting in terrain that is not of his choosing. And forcing your opponent to fight in terrain that is not to his advantage is a big part of the strategy and tactics of miniature wargaming. Not only that, but there are particular units who, again, in Lion Rampant, they have a feature where some guys, think of your classic Warhammer 40k orcs, they want to get stuck in. You think about heroic knights. When they see an enemy, they charge. In the case of Lion Rampant, we have a rule called Wild Charge. And at the very beginning of the turn, if your heavy unit happens to be walking by and whoops, oh my goodness, I have seen someone that I can attack, they have to Wild Charge. And if they succeed, they automatically charge. They are drawn to combat. This aggression will not stand. By placing our little weak puny guys in the woods, we can draw an opponent into fight on ground not of his choosing. Now, bear in mind, in this case, he only must make that check if he is within charge distance. So we'll slide our thing down. Our charge distance is 4 fingers. Now, normally, our elite guy could say, I will ignore them because I don't want to fight in there. But if you have that charge radius, it might force our elite unit to take a much wider circuit than he really wants to, lest he move within that halo within which he is required to charge. So now you have another case where the influence of the terrain piece is felt at a considerable distance away from that piece. And now you have not just the am I in or am I out? You also have this odd zone where a figure that has the required charge has to debate about whether he passes through that zone, and a unit that does not doesn't care. So you have functionally added multiple different layers to the kind of terrain and the influence of the terrain on the tabletop game. I thought this was a really interesting intellectual exercise, and even if I didn't quite agree or disagree with Glenn and Mike, I thought it was a really interesting conversation that they had, and I wanted to add in a couple of things that I thought they were given short shrift. For example, one of the complaints offered up by Glenn is that in many games you cannot move to melee unless you charge. You can only get to within 1 inch of a figure. Not only that, but you cannot charge in rough going unless you're already within that 1 inch, which presents a situation where Mr. Dwarf here moves to the 1 inch and he's going to charge the next turn, but our heavy armor guy backs up 1 inch. Okay, so on the next turn, our Mr. Dwarf will move up to the 1 inch, and then we'll just back off. And eventually you'll run out of terrain, probably. But how much fun is it to play this weird game of leapfrog? To which I can only say that's a valid argument. A game that doesn't allow for charging through rough ground had better not include that kind of situation, because that's just appalling. And I could not agree with them more. However, in games like Lion Rampant, Dragon Rampant, and the other members of the Rampant family, the only problem, the only condition on charging is, can you reach them? If they're within charge distance, it doesn't matter whether you're 1 inch away or not. It doesn't matter whether you're in the rough going or not. In fact, what's fascinating is if the defender is in rough going and you are not, it doesn't matter. If anybody's in the rough going, it still counts as a combat in rough going, which opens up the possibility for defending the edge of a woods. He presented the historical case where troops ambush from outside of woods, that woods are a viable place to stage an ambush. However, because we all have perfect knowledge, I can see the top of the table. Whoa, time out there, buddy. I have seen games where you are able to summon figures from terrain elements. These scouts can appear on, in this case, it would be like summoning. They can appear, but they only appear within the woods. So you do have a possibility for ambushing there. And in an odd way, a little bit of fog of war. If you have multiple forests and the player can choose which forest the unit appears in on subsequent turns, then you have a situation where the opponent doesn't know where those ambushers will appear and won't know until the worst possible time, which is the best possible time for the ambusher, of course. I don't really have like a big thing to tie a bow on this episode, really more of a thought exercise. And again, I speak contemporaneously. This is just me thinking out loud after having thought about it and talked to myself in the car for an hour. I guess the thing that I would leave you with is, this is a case, and here in the House of Wargaming, we love games that break the mold. We love analyzing conventional wisdom and identifying those areas where conventional wisdom is wrong. This is a case where I think conventional wisdom is right. The inclusion of terrain spaces that are not merely on versus off, in play versus out of play, but in a weird gray area where they're in play if you're willing to pay the price. And you get to decide whether they're in play or not based upon the rules of the game and based upon the profile of the figures that are interacting with not just this flat featureless plane, but the rough ground, which merely slows you down, or the rough ground, which slows you down and blocks line of sight, or the rough ground, which slows you down, blocks line of sight, and prevents all movement. I'm trying to think if there's a case of rough ground that blocks line of sight but allows for free movement. If you can think of one, there's a comment section right down there. Hey, I think this works great. I love it. I'm really good at math, so I like dividing by 2, and also as a primarily solo wargamer and a guy that doesn't play with jerks. Hey, you get to here. It was 2.5 inches. I got 3.5 inches left. Look, it's 1.5 inches. Whatever, 1 3/4. It's 2 inches. Whatever. It's fine. It all balances out in the end. I'm not going to stress out too much about it. I just do the math. You round up, you round down a little bit. You just do it the same way every time. We both do it the same way. It's even. It's fine. It's fine. I like this system. I think it works great. I think that they're overthinking it. Or is that underthinking it? I don't know. Whatever. Either way, I hope you enjoyed this little romp. And if you haven't already, go subscribe to Rule of Carnage, because they have all kinds of good thinking pieces on all kinds of good stuff like shooting and morale and AI systems and just great game design stuff. It'll really give you a deeper appreciation for this wonderful hobby of ours. Till next time, I'm praying for you.